transformative nature of knowledge. And participates in its generation. One understands the transformative nature of knowledge and participates in generating it. There are lots of readers who are not scholars. Now, a scholar who's not a reader is a dangerous thing. I'm not even sure that's possible, but okay. People pose as such. So when you put this person who understands knowledge, right, with this person who understands the transformative power of creation and creativity, right, you can come up with something very, 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 very remarkable. But you can also come up with things that clash. Like when I was writing The Coming, one of the things that I did not want is for people to write this off as fiction. Right? To say, well, you know, fiction means you made it up. Right? And number one, that's not what fiction means. Right? Fiction doesn't mean you made it up. Right? Sometimes fiction means that, but fiction does not always mean that, and it doesn't at all have to mean that. Sometimes what fiction means simply is I got to assume the voice that was not initially my own. Right? But everything is true. Right? And in this book, I made sure that every single factual reference made in this book, I made sure I had a textual reference for it so that if anybody ever challenged it, I'm ready for it. Because I didn't want anybody to ever write this off, right, as America will do, as being something imaginative that's beyond. Nobody really did that to anybody, right? That's not true at all. So when I began to write this, part of the struggle was not the factual information. Part of the struggle was, do I have to tell all of the facts? This is so painful. Can I tell some, right? But what became very clear to me is that the ancestors wanted a rendering of this in some ways that included what everybody else has been trying not to tell for years. Like even this notion of the rape of men, right? Which of course is in this text. I literally cannot tell you the number of people, the number of schools, even a few scholars who said, I've never heard of that. And people who said, I can't imagine that. I said, you can't imagine that? You can't imagine that in one's attempt to degrade and to demean an African man that they would have sexually violated? You can't imagine that? How is that not imaginable? In fact, that seems almost logical to me. But what was more intriguing is, why in God's name have historians not written about this? Why haven't people gone to find sources? So I asked a couple of historians, right? Their responses were even eerier. One historian said, well, you know, there's a price to pay, you know, to write about that. I said, oh, what is it? So there's a price? What's the price to be paid? Oh, wow, okay. Another historian said, well, I'm sure it happened, is how he said. He said, I'm absolutely sure it happened. But that's not really my interest. I said, oh, wow. And so I went looking for any full-length text, right, that treats this subject, and I did not find it. Right? And I looked for years and years and years. I said, there's no full-length text on the sexual violation, the sexual assault in the antebellum period, in terms of black men and black male bodies. I said, how is that possible? This scholarly gap. You understand what I'm saying? Right? However, in this creative space, I wanted to write about it. Right? So one, I had to go find me a source, or two, or three, which I did. Right? The other thing is, I had to be okay with the notion of putting this out in the public sphere, right? And what that could possibly mean for the conclusions people would draw about me for my willingness to write that. You understand what I'm saying? Yes. Right? And so that's very important, though. That's very, very important. But I said not to do it is not to honor some ancestors. And now if I'm going to pick which ancestors I'm not going to honor, I can stop this whole project.
Yes.
I can stop this whole project. And I said, no, every single ancestor is going to be honored. Every ancestor that every laid in any ship, on any day, through any year, At any point, I want those ancestors to be honored in this text. Right? But again, if you're going to be an artist, you got to pay the price to reshape consciousness. And there is a price to be paid. Because people want affirmation of comfortability.
Yes.
The notion that you're going to disturb how people have understood history, that you're going to reread, you're going to refashion, right, someone's clarity of who they are. Another good example of this, I was at Rutgers or somewhere, and a white woman stood up and she said, Dr. Black, oh my God, the coming is amazing, it's awesome, it's wonderful, and I really appreciate you writing this book because I feel like I learned so much about your history. I said, ma'am. She raised it because I raised my hand. I said, ma'am. And the whole argument, I said, do you realize there are as many white people on this ship as black people? Your ancestors are on this boat too. I wrote your story. This just ain't the part you want. And she said, and she was honest, she said, I have to be honest, I never, ever thought of that. I said, ma'am, your people are on this same boat as my people. This story is just told from the perspective of my people. But isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting how you could totally and completely absolve yourself while you're focusing on, quote unquote, my story? How do you miss your people upstairs? Well, I mean, you know, because see, if in fact these are my people, and they are, right? You have an ancestral inheritance of violence. You have an ancestral inheritance of abuse, which you have to claim. Right? Just as a scholar, I'm giving it to you. Right? And it was a little tight in the room for a minute. Josh, it was a little tense. Right? And so, you know, I said, congratulations. You know, now you know some of your history also. And this is very important because ultimately, when you start doing the work of a scholar and the work of an artist, right, you won't get to pick which pains and which woes you tell, right? You'll have to tell them all. And some of them will critique you. Y'all know what the hardest part of writing this book was? I'm gonna show you the page. The hardest page in this book